My name is Father Drasmus. I'm the Principal of the Institute here in Cambridge. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all for our annual international conference. It's wonderful to see so many people coming from literally all over the world, from near and far. We have people coming from Iceland, people coming from Germany, from the UK, people coming from as far away as Western Canada, which is quite a feat of modern travel. So that's wonderful. It's
From Greece.
Greece as well.
Oh.
Center of the world.
Center of the world, indeed.
For some.
The ex-center of the world.
We're working to making it back the center.
Okay.
So it's a great pleasure. I look very forward to the conference, particularly because of the spread of people contributing this year to the conference. I only want to speak for another 2-3 minutes. I shared the time with Christoph for introductions and announcements this morning, so I don't want to go over 5 minutes. But I want to say 2 things in the last 3 minutes that I have left, I think. One of them is about the conference as a general thing, particularly about the poster of our conference, because it says something about the topic and about how we approached this conference when we thought of organizing it. Then the other thing is a little bit about the Institute, because this might be the first time that you are here, first time you're engaging with the Institute, the Orthodox Institute in Cambridge. If you pay attention when you have coffee later to the poster, if you haven't already, you will see that it has one of these very strange pictures on it, which we think combines tradition and innovation, which are kind of the main purposes of the conference. It's a picture from a church in Iași, in Romania, and it depicts an event that took place in 1996. It was the first time that the relics, head of Saint Apostle Andrew was brought to Iași, to Romania. And the picture shows that the relics are being taken from one plane and then taken to another plane. So when they arrive there by plane, they're left by plane. If people will look at pictures online, they will see that when they were processed through the city, at some point they were placed on a tank. There were soldiers, there was military, so a very kind of non-traditional way of approaching a procession. It was very festive. So we thought that that's a very good image to encapsulate the ethos of the conference here. And it also highlights the tension between tradition and innovation, between the past, the present and the future, that we sometimes feel very strongly, particularly in the Orthodox Church. What's interesting also in relation to that picture, and it speaks about this tension between tradition and innovation, is that day, the 13th of October, if I'm right, was then made a feast. It was entered into the calendar of the Romanian Orthodox Church as the feast of the bringing of the relics of St. Andrew to Romania. So one picture tells you how things become tradition, or how they become part of the church and the worship life of the church, and then the theology of it and everything else. I think that is one picture that can make us think about these things. And then the other thing I said was about the Institute. The Institute itself, I think, in Cambridge has existed for about 20 years. I think we're officially celebrating 20 years next year. And I think we share some of this ethos of the newness of the old. The Institute in itself is a unique place. It's the only Orthodox Institute in Cambridge, and one of the few places in the UK that offers Orthodox education or access to Orthodox education. It's a place of meeting and encounter, of dialogue. So we are combining, I think, this reality of the tradition with the newness, with asking new questions and trying to see how we negotiate the reality in which we live. And the ecumenical fellowship that we tend to share, particularly here in the West. So I hope that you will develop an interest in the Institute, starting from this conference, and hopefully this will be an event that you remember for a long time and rejoice in the fellowship and in the academic exchange. Thank you very much. Christoph, over to you.
So very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Christoph Schneider. I'm the academic director of this institute. And I will now say a few words about the topic of the conference, and then I will introduce our first speaker, Reverend Professor Nikolaos Loudovikos. So, the newness of the old. Already in the New Testament, in the Gospel of John, we find the paradoxical situation that the truth is on the one hand identified with Jesus Christ, John 14:6. On the other hand, the evangelist tells us that the Spirit of truth will guide disciples of Christ into all truth. This is the basic theological framework within which the question of tradition, of preservation and innovation must be discussed. Christian theology and Christian practice transcends any simplistic dichotomy between a conservative and a progressive orientation, because the most fundamental Christian doctrine, the doctrine of the Trinity, entails both a conservative as well as a progressive aspect. On the one hand, Christians look back to the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, who lived in a particular historical context and at a particular time in history. In and through Jesus Christ, God once and for all revealed himself as creative love, as the creator, redeemer and sanctifier of humankind and all creation. On the other hand, Christians look forward to the eschatological consummation of creation and the second coming of the risen Christ. Christians are conservative because they believe that the truth has been fully disclosed in the past, but they are progressive as they are convinced that the full significance and transformative power of this past event will only be revealed and actualized gradually in the course of history and at the second coming of Christ. One could even go so far as to say that only the human response to the divine call, which then takes place through Christ and the Holy Spirit, makes fully manifest who Christ really is and what the truth is. This brief sketch is only the starting point, of course, of an extremely complex philosophical and theological debate. And, this is the debate we'd like to have in the next 2 days. Let us briefly look at tradition from a philosophical point of view. 20th century continental and, to some extent, analytic philosophy was characterized by a rehabilitation of the idea of tradition and authority. In his famous essay, What is Enlightenment? Was ist Aufklärung? Published in 1784, Immanuel Kant expressed the spirit of the Enlightenment as follows. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity, Unmündigkeit in German. Immaturity, he writes, is the inability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance. This immaturity is self-imposed if its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in indecision and lack of courage to use one's own mind without another's guidance. Dare to know, Kant points out. Have the courage to use your own understanding is therefore the motto of the Enlightenment. Laziness and cowardice are the reasons why such a large part of mankind gladly remain minors all their lives, long after nature has freed them from external guidance. They are the reasons why it is so easy for others to set themselves up as guardians. It is so comfortable to be a minor. If I have a book that thinks for me, a pastor who acts as my conscience, a physician who prescribes my diet, and so on. Then I have no need to exert myself. Yet in the 19th and 20th century, the notion of the pure universal atemporal reason, unmediated by tradition, was radically questioned. In the 20th century, continental philosophy, in the wake of Heidegger and many others like Gadamer and Ricoeur, came to emphasize the finite historical and perspectival character of all human thinking. We are told that we always already interpret the world and that we cannot interpret it without presuppositions, prejudices, and prejudgments, Vorurteile. As Gadamer writes, the fundamental prejudice or prejudgments, Vorurteile, the fundamental prejudice or prejudgments of the Enlightenment is the prejudice against prejudice itself, which denies tradition its power. Key terms such as Dasein, being in the world, Thronness, as a translation of the German Geworfenheit, or horizon, interpretative horizon, express the historical finitude of human existence and the fact that we always interpret the world from a particular vantage point that remains contingent. This story has been told many times and has led to something like a partial, at least partial, rehabilitation of tradition and authority, even in philosophical circles. For this reason, it has also been used by Christian theology to defend the specifically Christian notion of tradition, at least in the Catholic, Anglo-Catholic and Orthodox churches. And the Protestants, of course, are less interested in the notion of tradition. However, this reading that places the stress on the discontinuity between Kant and 20th century philosophy is incomplete, I think. During this conference, we also need to talk about the continuity between Kant and these new models in phenomenology and continental philosophy. According to the French philosopher Comte d'Amersault, a great deal of 20th century continental philosophy can be viewed as a continuation or even radicalization of the Kantian opacity of the thinking itself and of Kant's post-metaphysical finitism. In the wake of Kant, it is believed that we can only have access to the correlation between thinking and being, but never to either of them taken in isolation. We have been told that it is impossible for the human mind to take an external perspective on the act of cognition and to compare the world as it is in itself to the world as it is for us. To distinguish what results from our relationship with the world from that which only belongs to the world. Language can certainly transcend itself towards the world, but there is only a world insofar as consciousness transcends itself towards it. This has, of course, far-reaching consequences for our understanding of tradition. As Ms. Gilson has pointed out, a negative finitude sees our finite condition as a hindrance to knowledge. So we cannot know the world as it is in itself. Finitude, however, can also be viewed as the vehicle of infinitude. In the first case, in the case of negative finitude, language and tradition can only lead to intersubjective truths despite its positive ordering function. But the notion of tradition will not be compatible with a realist position. We can talk about the linguistification of Kant's transcendental categories, perhaps. In the second case, tradition and language are that which enables us to perceive the infinite in and through the finite. This model is based on a Homoousian Christology, as opposed to the Kantian dualism. In other words, we have to be careful when theology celebrates the return of tradition in 20th century philosophy. For the presupposition of this particular idea of tradition may have may be quite different from that of Orthodox Christianity. Of course, one has to look at these thinkers in more detail, but this negative finitude is certainly dominant in Heidegger, and I think that's something we need to discuss also in the next few days. So this was my brief introduction, and now I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker. It is Reverend Professor Nikolaos Loudovikos. He is professor at the University Ecclesiastical Academy of Thessaloniki in Greece. He's also a visiting professor at our institute, the Institute for Orthodox Religious Studies, and he's an honorary research fellow at the University of Winchester. Father Nikolaos is one of the leading Orthodox theologians and also a founding father of our institute, I should mention. He has published about 13 books. Unfortunately, most of them are not yet available in English. So I will just mention these two translated books. The first one, I think is based on his PhD, is the revised version of his PhD, entitled A Eucharistic Ontology, Maximus the Confessor's Eschatological Ontology of Being as Dialogical Reciprocity, and was translated by Elizabeth Jokrita, who happens to be here. And the second book came out in 2016. It's called Church in the Making, an apophatic ecclesiology of consubstantiality. Now, the title of our conference is The Newness of the Old, and I think this title is quite suitable to characterize the content of Father Nikolaos' book, because on the one hand, it is really based on the patristic tradition. He was also the assistant of Metropolitan John Zizoulas in Greece at the beginning of his career, but it is really the newness of the old, because Father Nikolaos is really able to relate patristic thought to contemporary thought, and he's also a very ecumenically minded theologian. So we're very grateful that he has accepted our invitation, and today Father Nikolaos is going to talk about bringing new spirit to the old letter, Maximus the Confessor's teaching on pleasure and pain, and the Palamite distinction between essence and energies in the modern readings as examples. Father Nikolaos, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Christoph, and I'm happy to be here once again, and this place is full of memories, dear colleagues and friends. So I think that this conference was a good idea. I hope it's proved to be a good idea. And yes, I'm going to offer some food for thought here with what I'm going to say here. This is the way I see my presentation, which is a written presentation. I don't like to read before. It's much better if we can discuss. And the Greek tradition, if we speak of tradition, is the symposium. We discuss rather than passively, listen. And it's good if you could interrupt me in my every second phrase. But okay, this cannot function, so I have somehow to submit and read, at least in the beginning. So it was here in Cambridge, Virginia Woolf, in 1923, started her famous lecture on modern literature with the phrase, "Suddenly, around 1910, human nature changed." Indeed, human nature had started changing long before Woolf's circle, along with the other groups of intellectuals in Cambridge, such as the poisonous apostles. You know about this, realize that. If this change is the self-sufficient humanism, its story has been recently told again brilliantly by thinkers such as Charles Taylor in his classic Secular Age, and Rémy Brague, Le règne de l'homme. In any case, even the enlightened, detached self, Kantian self, for example, was strongly doubted after Nietzsche and his change of ecstatic transcendence into will to power, and the re-evaluation of materiality, or after Freud and his rediscovery of the unconscious, which is now decisively psychobiological, after Feuerbach, Engel, and Marx in the wake of sociality, and later with Husserl and the person in the subjectivity. However, this lack of any recognizable meaning that was suddenly discovered or perhaps imposed by intellectuals like Virginia Woolf is in a sense revealing. This is, I think, the first sign of the great change that happened in the Western existence during the 20th century. I mean the change within what I have recently called the ontology of the self-referring subject, which led this subject to radically disputing human nature itself. And that is something that we can call, in a philosophical, not only psychological language, narcissism. Because as a spiritual phenomenon, narcissism is not an affirmation, as many perhaps think, an affirmation, but rather a denial of human nature. Narcissism is a denial of human nature. Its closest philosophical concept is that of the will to power, as an unending internal transcendence, which always puts human nature beyond any essential limit, beyond its natural identity. The closest ethical concept here is perhaps MacIntyre's emotivism, which unsurprisingly also results to the will to power. Narcissism culminates in evaporating human nature into a pure fantasy of power, imagined spiritual omnipotence and pan-domination. Jean-Luc Bresson's film Lucy is an accurate description of it. Moreover, narcissism is not a denial of relation, as it is usually thought, but on the contrary, the most common type of relation. But it is an inclusion of any relation within the self, in a sort of monological reciprocity, if you allow me this oxymoron. Narcissism is not necessarily against tradition. Modern man prefers, as Adony Giddens has shown, an eclectic use of it, in a way that the dream of omnipotence is maintained and reinforced. Sometimes these persons seem to be extremely devoted to tradition, which they totally destroy by dissolving it into quanta of power, both individually and as communities, imagined communities, to use Benedict Anderson's term. In these cases, tradition becomes a dangerous ideological salad of concepts contradicting each other, a weapon made of sacred texts, always taken literally, and killing imaginary or real opponents. It's also possible that tradition is rejected in an alleged eschatological way, in both the theological and the secular sense, the latter concerning a blind faith in an internal and blissful progress, in a way which already was paved by Condorcet and Stay Alive through modern lifestyle, stays alive, while the former represents a kind of ecstatic eschatology, the continuity of which, with the theological parts is constantly fading. However, it tends to become, mainly for cultural and historical reasons, the most common attitude of many Orthodox theologians who cannot find ways of a fertile communication with their uncommitted intellectual environment. But can we, after all this discussion, give an anti-narcissistic ecclesial definition of tradition that excludes some of the dangers described above? In our post-Derridian times, where all the existential or ontological concepts, along with the texts that they are drawing on, are suspicious of exercising an oppressive authority, and so they clearly need some deconstruction, tradition can no longer be defined as merely a deposit of texts. However, It is true that the Christian tradition had never been defined primarily as a certain deposit of texts, but as a worshiping community, a Eucharistic assembly, where interpretation was precisely a Eucharistic interpretation, i.e. a description, a reference to, an announcement of a new divine mode of existence brought into creation through Christ by the Spirit in the Church. The Greek word paradosis, which is the equivalent to tradition, coming from the verb paradidomi, the ancient verb paradidomi, or the modern verb paradido, or in the passive voice paradidome, means first, of course, a sort of complete and total offering, but also it means to surrender, both in ancient and modern Greek, either as a verb or as a noun. Thus, paradosis can be understood as a dynamic historical event of a constant decision on the part of a community or a man, which was a member of this community, to surrender himself to the truth, which is, on the other hand, surrendered to us precisely through our surrender to it. This existential definition of tradition, or as paradosis or surrender, is excellently exemplified, in my view, in a wonderfully bold phrase of Maximus the Confessor's, «Δόμεν ουν εαυτούς ολοκλήρους το Θεό, in ολόκληρον αυτόν αντιλάβαμεν». Let us then give the whole of ourselves to God in order to receive back the whole of Him. In this sense, paradosis is a mutual exchange of gifts out of God's providential love, and man's grateful adidos is counter-offering, as I have called it this in the past, a dialogical reciprocity. Thus, the essence of tradition as paradosis is freedom and love, free and unconditionally loving divine offering on the one hand, and free and grateful human response as participation, or better, participatory interpretation on the other. This dialogical freedom gives us the chance to understand divine and human things in our own personal rhythm and way. Christ becomes, in a way, each one's Christ, according to Maximus' wonderful phrase. But perhaps even the term interpretation here must be understood somehow beyond God, and may recur in a maximalist manner as meaning the whole of human and worldly existence, which is given as an absolute gift, paradidete, on the part of God. And this precisely means that created nature as a whole can surrender itself to its ultimate source and meaning, to its source of an unperishable life, through and in the worshiping community. Eucharist is the only ontological interpretation of creation and the only dialogical reciprocity or paradosis that we really have. In this sense, human nature, through this understanding of paradosis, is always new, always other, always more enlightened as it is by its divine source. In this sense, paradosis or tradition has to do with the life and the spirit, and the continuity of this life and the spirit in the Church. And it is not a repetition of ideas accepted in the past. It is possible for someone to be a contemporary father of the Church in the Spirit without having read the text of the Fathers. This is why I sometimes do not like the Florovskian term neo-patristic synthesis, if by this we mean a sort of given matrix of concepts and meanings, which have to be exclusively followed and uncritically repeated. On the other hand, it is utterly important to read the works of the great fathers precisely in order to fathom the deeply free and existential and loving way, a charitable way they have assimilated in the spirit the written tradition. Genuine theology is always new, I insist on that, if you allow me. Always contemporary, always contextual, always surrendering itself to Christ, who is the only theologian, and having him surrendered to their total surrender. Now, after this long introduction, let me switch now to my subject. The first chapter is called Beyond Pleasure and Pain. And first, how can we read Maximus the Confessor's doctrine on pleasure and pain today? For Maximus, this doctrine presupposes an internal split in man due to his autonomous use of the senses, not anymore as a chance for God's spiritual beauty to be admired, fathomed, admired, but as a means of pleasure, for pleasure. Thus pleasure was created not by God but by man. And this forced God to allow pain, along with death, which is the ultimate pain, to punish and educate human deviation, which deviation is in its deep core idolatry, according to Maximus. All these things are Maximus. Just repeat. Therefore, pleasure and pain do not initially belong to human nature, but they are both post-lapsarian, and they are close to the irrational natures, the former showing the corruption of human, pleasure showing the corruption of human proeresis, and the latter, pain bringing the dissolution of human nature in order for this irrationality to be abolished. In this way, an existential dialectic between pleasure and pain has been established within human nature on the common ground of philautia. I will use the word in Greek. Philautia is love for oneself. You're loving yourself. Which is then defined precisely in terms of this dialectic as the endorsement of sensual bodily pleasure and the avoidance of pain. This is what Maximus says, this definition of philautia. It is notable that Maximus defines pleasure almost exclusively as a matter of senses and as purely irrational, pulling the inattentive mind toward this irrationality to its detriment. Thus the mind is trapped in the surface of things, as Maximus writes. It loses his natural divine object of contemplation and love and becomes a prisoner of the sensual beauty of things and their pleasures. So it seems that for Maximus, to disengage the mind from the senses and make it their master is the only way to escape pleasure and pain and transform pleasure into contemplation. However, things have become considerably more complicated today. Modern man does not want to quit pleasure, since it is part of his personal truth, and his self-understanding passes through it. It is a part of the modern technologies of the self, in Foucault's terms. On the other hand, contrary to the Maximian philautia, modern narcissistic pleasure is not necessarily bound with sensual pleasure, but it can be utterly painful and even ascetical. Let's remember, for example, Weber's capitalist or Gergen's modern saturated self, where the deepest narcissistic pleasure is connected with the most inexorable privation of both psychological and bodily pleasures. Or let's see a PhD student in Cambridge. Can be absolute narcissism without pleasure. The final absolute acceptance of narcissism or philautia today, not only on the part of the modern lifestyle, but also on the part of modern psychology. Freud would never agree with Heinz Kohut, for example, in his accepting of narcissism, which is very important. I started as a psychoanalyst, and I'm very sensible what happens in modern depth psychology is revealing. We started from a genuine rejection of narcissism by Freud, and now we have a plain acceptation. We absolutely accept narcissism. And this is very telling. It's revealing for how we understand human nature today. We can discuss about that. Along with the psychology accepts narcissism along with its peculiar asceticism. And this shows that modern philautia is clearly a part of a sort of a religion of narcissism. The self-referring subject is not simply ambitious, but it organizes his self-fulfillment through his narcissistic desire of melting with the ultimate thing, the ultimate meaning, God, regardless the existential cost, making it a part of his own self-development, something that finally can turn to be even paranoiac. This paranoia cannot be detected easily. but it's part of the Western civilization, especially in its Anglo-American tradition. Okay, we can discuss about that. In more regular cases, the culture of immediate pleasure wants that this pleasure become continuous and unlimited. Again, we need a culture of pain in order not to punish pleasure, but on the contrary, in order to safeguard it, i.e. to defend it against other narcissisms. We need pain in order to defend our narcissism against other narcissism. Thus, even love today becomes more and more violent, since it feels that it has somehow to defend or protect itself against the narcissistic absorption by its objects. Because today we consume the love. It's one thing to accept love, and another thing to consume love. In this way, nowadays narcissism has become monstrous and uncontrollably excessive. And it lies indeed beyond pleasure and pain. How then can we read Maximus on pleasure and pain today? It was impossible for Maximus to know that there exists a sort of philautia which is even against pleasure, or a substitute pleasure, which uses pain in order precisely to redeem pleasure. Of course, his idea was not that every bodily pleasure leads us unavoidably to philautia, needing a painful punishment to recover. Doxology is the other path left open. For him, the question of the ultimate meaning, i.e. of the divine presence within the created beauty, is answered in the affirmative. St. Maximus' ultimate teaching for us is thus to always look for this ultimate meaning, this divine presence behind any sort of pleasure and pain, rather than surrendering to this asceticism or narcissism. Pleasure and pain can somehow become identical today, have become somehow identical today, before the great painful pleasure of narcissism, which is the idolatry par excellence of our times. And Maximus fights precisely against this sort of idolatry, which denies the divinity of creation for the alleged and fake divinity of its narcissistic consummation. We have many things to say about that, but we have to move to the next chapter because of the time. This next chapter is called Intermeaningfulness, intersubjectivity in the making. And let's turn now to St. Gregory Palamas. Once again, it's not self-evident that the Asceticism distinction, supported also by all the great Orthodox theologians of the 20th century, even Bulgakov finally identified that he suffers with the doctrine of the uncreated energies, can be properly understood by a modern Western man, precisely because the modern understanding of the term energy has nothing to do with what Palamas and so many of his spiritual ancestors and successors wanted to convey. Thus, while Palamas wanted to show through this doctrine that the Triune God, the Father, through the Son, and the Holy Spirit gets indeed the in-person communion with created beings, a communion that takes place both inside and outside him, the modern understanding of energy is impersonal. And this means that it has nothing to do with intention, goal, and in a word, meaning. Okay? However, as I will strive to show, this Palamite interhypostatic synergy between man and God, as I call it, mainly aims at creating an intermeaningfulness between them. Intermeaningfulness is the only fire we have Elizabeth Theocritou with us. I created first a Greek term, the term noimatosis, and I tried to translate it in English. It's intermeaningfulness. It's not the accurate translation, but I cannot find any other English word. Noimatosis. I'll explain the difference, but this is the current term that I can use now to somehow express myself. How can I understand Palamas at this point? We'll need many Wittgenstein and second Aristotle in order to prove this, of course. It's undoubtedly true that Wittgenstein never read Aristotle, of course. Of course, he never read Palamas. However, it seems that there exists some fascinating proximities between the way the so-called second Wittgenstein understood the intersubjective constitution of meaning. In speaking of constitution of meaning, here, I cannot help thinking that another transcendental trap lies before our eyes. Modern man appropriates for himself any meaning, appropriates, usurps any meaning for himself. In this sense, Edmund Husserl is but the systematic philosophical peak of an old subjectivistic obelisk, but this is another long discussion. Through narcissism, everyone almost self-evidently appropriates the ultimate meaning for himself without even thinking of the opposite. Which is the opposite? To get appropriated by the ultimate meaning. Let's keep this in mind. So, fascinating proximities between the way the so-called second Wittgenstein understood the intersubjective constitution of meaning and the Palamite reading of the Aristotelian concept of energy in metaphysics lambda. And let's also compare this with Thomas Aquinas in order to see a little difference that exists between them in this understanding. Now, if we start our investigation in a preposterous way with Palamas, I'm afraid I have time yet. Still. As I have claimed elsewhere, in order to explain the Palamite definition of the essence-energies distinction better, we must start with his initial endorsement of the patristic distinction between essence and will in God. As you know, Gregory starts here from Justin the Martyr, continues through the Cyril of Alexandria, Athanasius the Great, Maximus the Confessor, John Damascene, and repeats this distinction between will and nature, and then logos and nature in Maximus, and then he goes to the multiple names of God, taking this from the Areopagite, processions, also by Dionysius, names of God is by Basil, participations, Dionysius and Maximus, divinity, Gregory of Nyssa, and the uncreated things around God, Maximus again, and all this as continual and in eternal glory, John Damascene, providence and goodness of God, Gregory of Nyssa, and all this is the wisdom and power and art and the divine longing of things that are created energies in a way, in one word. Thus, for the Hestica saint, quote, if there is no difference between divine essence and divine energy, then giving them birth to the Son or spirating the Spirit is not different from creating. We have to understand the difference between creation and birth of the Son. That means that for Palamas, following the Greek patristic tradition, it is impossible to establish a real distinction between God and the world, as well as a deep connection between them without the concepts of divine energies. In Palamas's vocabulary, however, this distinction does not compromise either the divine unity or the divine simplicity. And it only means that paradoxically divinity is not exhaustively expressed in its communion with creation, although it is divinity in its totality that comes in communion with beings, or in other words, this distinction means that God is always more than his essential expressions. What Palamas wanted to say was simply that, in order to use an example, that Father Loudovikos now is talking to you, and this is an energy of his. But if you add all of his energies, all of his books, all of his articles, the equation does not give Father Loudovikos. You understand? He's always more. This is the distinction. As also, sometimes I said this to Milbank and said to it, oh, I never thought of like this before. But this is, in simple words, this distinction. That we are always more. The essence somehow is more. But that does not mean that the essence is something different. No, it's the expression of the essence as the expression of the energy, of the essence. Gregory says, when you hear the fathers calling the divine essence non-participated in, think that they mean that essence as it is in itself, without expressing itself to the world. When you hear them calling it participated in, think that they thus mean the procession and the expression of the energy which pre-exists in God. But if you think that through this energy it is the very divine essence that expresses itself, even not thoroughly, you are not out of the terms of piety. Or he says that it is possible to use the name of divine essence even for the energies, and it is impossible to consider energies as sorts of natures or beings different from the essence. You know how many good scholars in the West have thought about this in that way. I mean, if there's henats or beings, outside God, and thus they rejected the energies. But Palamas does not say this. So the final textures of the doctrine of energy is Christological. In his treatises against Akindinus, Palamas refers explicitly to St. John Chrysostom's teaching on the fact that Christ's possession of the Spirit does not mean anything different, that the acquisition of the fullness of divine energies, than the acquisition of the fullness of divine energies in his human nature. For Palamas, this goes in parallel with St. Cyril's position that through the hypostatic union, Christ gives his human nature all the energies of his divine nature, possessed by him in common with the Father and the Spirit. This is very, very important, and this assertion establishes a Christology of energies as he understands the Christ event as the very foundation of his ultimate understanding of energies as dialogical events. Energies are dialogical events. They're not just an outpouring, an impersonal outpouring, an emanation. Okay, dialogical events. We have two energies, always two, always two. It's divine energy and created energy. Okay, and this is conveyed through Christology in the whole world. We do not know of other expression of this. In Christ, we do not have a confusion of nature, but a hypostatic union through the perfect perichoresis of the two natures, and that means through the complete dialogue of created and uncreated energies in him. Christ's theandric energy, a term used not by the Monophysites, but by Maximus, theandric, is nothing other than a dialogical synergy of his two natures through their respective natural energies, which synergy makes them perfectly coexist and collaborate. No passivity is accepted in Palamas or in Maximus. If I don't have energies, I'm just flooded by divine energies. This is not salvation. This is my extermination. In other words, while we can affirm that every energy comes from the Father through the Son by the Spirit after the incarnation, energies as donation of the Spirit to created nature are received through a dialogical synergy of Christ's two natures in his unique hypostasis. And so it is crystal clear that for Palamas the energies are not essences and hypostases around God. This is why Palamas insists in many passages that the energies are not enhypostatic, as only the three persons of the Trinity are. There is only one sense in which the energies can be called enhypostatic, but not self-hypostatic, as he says. Quote, they are called so because the Spirit infuses the energy into another person's hypostasis where it can be seen. Or, in other understanding, because the energy remains forever in the beings where it is sent. That means that the presence of God in creation is real. God does not transform himself in a created substitute somehow, but he is indeed in creation. Otherwise, we do not have any sort of dialogue. We have just an imposition which is a dictation of something which is not God. God dictates something which is not his essence anymore. Now, I don't want to get you... I have written some pages on Aristotle. I'm going to skip some of them in order not to I just want to show here that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But I just want to see, just to say here that I do not agree with Ross's translation of Aristotle's expression noisis noisius. He says God is noisis noisius. Ross's translation is thinking as a thinking on thinking. No. My view is that it says here thinking on himself as thinking. Noisis noisius means thinking on myself as thinking. And this is why Aristotle has written texts like the little text, the following text that I'm going to read for you, the only one. Allow me, please. And life also belongs to God. In metaphysics. For the actuality of thought is life, and God is that actuality. And God's self-dependent actuality is life, most good and eternal. We say, therefore, that God is a living being, eternal, most good, so that life and duration continues and eternally belong to God, for this is God. And precisely this life has somehow to be important. For many of the readers of Aristotle, I refer the names here, this noisis noisius, this perfection of self-thought, does not need to create things outside. But for Aristotle, it is impossible. I mean, it is probable that perfection here means also to be able somehow to extend this energy, which is the energy of self-fulfillment, the actus purus, outside. And that is the way Palamas read Aristotle. It is impossible to think of knowledge or perception or opinion or understanding without thinking at the very same moment of the subject who knows, I say this, or understands itself, whether the subject is identified with the object or not. So the prime mover's internal energy of thinking that realizes itself as life, through thinking on himself as thinking, moves beings, thus imparting this energy or life or thinking outside him, turning towards the world in an intentional way. That was briefly the way Palamas, following the Greek patristic of line of thought, understood Aristotle. The problem, I'm going to show how Aquinas understood Aristotle briefly in a while. The problem of dialogical reciprocity or synergy between God and creation, along with that of providence, remains, of course, unsolved by the Greek philosopher. There also exist some other difficult problems here, as it is pointed out by some Aristotelian scholars. I do not simply mean the aforementioned problem of the existence of providence here. It is true that only Franz Brentano was so bold as to claim such a position, which was convincingly refuted by Zeller and others, but also the problem of whether God possesses an objective knowledge of the world or not, according to metaphysics. Starting from Hegel, this problem caused a great variety of answers, most important of which, according to my view, is perhaps that of Cosman, for whom the concept of noisis noisius does not simply mean a self-thinking, self-consciousness, but also a need for intentional reference ad extra. However, as I think this reference first is not simply an act of or an objective or not of an objective understanding, but an act of automatic radiation in particle life. And second, this reference seems to be simply an internal requirement of Aristotle's theologic, just in order for God's self-thinking to have an audience, a second pole, in order for it not to be arbitrary or irrational. It is not an intentional, absolute intentional relationship, reciprocal relation with being existing outside him. This is the collapsing point of Aristotle's metaphysics. It is precisely here that Palamas can advance much further. So for Palamas, the saints unite with God. They become one with him. If this happens by essence, this would result in monophysitism, a confusion of created and uncreated essences. If this happens by hypostasis, that could result in Sabellianism, one essence in many hypostases. What is left to achieve union? It is left to achieve union by energy. The term that is used to describe this union is anacrasis. Another term not easily translatable in English, we might say commixture. If we take into account that the meaning of the Greek word is that the elements commixed again remain unconfused, although they indwell in each other. Palamas understands this deified participation precisely as anacrasis. This is the existential content of the baptismal iothesia of man in Christ through the Spirit, when this adoption is consciously elaborated through grace. The body and the soul, in its absolute unity of mind, desire, and affectivity, become co-eternal in this transforming psychosomatic vision of the uncreated light, which is what we finally call union of God, with or without light. A state where man becomes light and sees through light, and sees himself through light, and whatever he says is also light. In other words, a state where the eschatological status of human nature and God seems to start here and now, in order to be accomplished in the end time. But the most important thing concerning the Palamite concept of deification as a participational anacrasis or ascent to God through the divine energies manifested in Christ by the Spirit is its absolutely relational or koinonetic character, beyond any monological, Aristotelian or Neoplatonic divine intentionality. The energies themselves are relational participation, as he explicitly writes, dialogical as analogical, for two absolutely connected reasons. First, because for Palamas, following Dionysius and Maximus, the divine processions or participations on logi as expressions of the divine loving will are deeply connected with the concept of analogy. This is a term which signifies a deep dialogue of synergy, again, or better, synergy, since analogy for the above authors, clearly for Dionysius, refers not to a similitude of essences, but to an analogous action between different agents in order for them to achieve union. This is the way Dionysius understands analogy, identifying it with synergy. Thus, divine energies as a participable expression of divine will is dialogical, in the sense that it calls for an energetic, active response on the part of its recipients. This is the first way of understanding energies as dialogical, synergetic events of analogical participation, or in our terms, as events of created common meaningfulness, or much better, intermeaningfulness between man and God. What I want to initially signify through the term intermeaningfulness is precisely this synergetic process of creating meaning together, not just imposed meaning, dictated meaning, both created and uncreated meaning, by God and man. On the one hand, God proposes this meaning, and on the other hand, he accepts modes and levels of human understanding, and those concepts or everything, and thus he accepts being given meaning by man, and become Abraham's and Isaac's and Jacob's God, i.e. a God who respects and perpetuates human otherness without dissolving it or absorbing it. Finally, Christ represents the fulfilling, this full intermeaningfulness, the perfect meaning of God and the perfect meaning of man in a deep hypostatic dialogical unity. And of course, the second way of understanding energies, and through their participation, is expressed in the ecclesial koinonetic core of Palamite understanding of participation. I don't want to say many things about this. When Palamas speaks of communion with God, he always means vertical but also horizontal communion. In a sense, giving meaning to creation, giving meaning to the others, allowing them to give meaning to you and being meaningful for them, is one and the same thing with being in communion with God. Now let's introduce, while I have a little time, Wittgenstein to our discussion and to understand how we use it. In his second great philosophical work, The Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein tries to emerge from his logical individualism, from the solipsism, if you like, which essentially he accepts in the Tractatus, by creating now a social phenomenology, one could say, of language. Thus, whereas in the Tractatus solipsism is essentially accepted, with the correction, of course, that here language does not say the word, but shows it by its limits, and the metaphysical subject is regarded as the limit of the world path through language, in such a way that the solipsism is identified with pure realism. In their investigations, private language and any kind of solipsism are condemned. The concept of the language games is introduced. Common linguistic rules and criteria of meanings, which make the common linguistic proposals purely empirical, i.e. non-philosophical, exercising a regulative pressure within the framework of specific forms of life. These forms dictate specific common linguistic usages and justify them absolutely, precisely within the set boundaries of their common usage. Being or the good continue to remain inaccessible, hidden like hints in the surface grammar of the common language games, whereas philosophy continues to be unable to draw metaphysical conclusions apart from affirming only that which all accept. It is, I think, very interesting that although Wittgenstein appears to reveal the social character of language, or meaning, he continues, which is revolutionary for the West, he continues to deny it any access to the absolute. He is unable to discern any trace of ontology in this movement toward inner meaningfulness, to use the term that we have coined already, and consequently attribute to it an ontological base or function. Thus, this sort of apophatism risks working to the detriment of ontology. And at the end of the day, Wittgenstein was a Jew, so he could not understand incarnation well. However, this radical criticism of private language in the investigations is especially significant because it gives a fatal blow to solipsism and the foundations of a theory of language that would have served precisely as an instrument of an individualistic metaphysical possession of meaningfulness on the part of the subject, defining such a language as those sounds that all the others do not understand, while I appear to understand them. Wittgenstein regards the private language and subsequently the private meaningfulness as the greatest enemy of the common forms of life, which as common social realities constitute the common truth of human life. Now turns here, this double participation analogy of this inner meaningfulness seems to be close to what the second Wittgenstein wanted to signify by replacing any remnant of philosophical metaphysics with a deeper intersubjectivity in the making. This is the way I understand Wittgenstein. An intersubjectivity in the making. He wants to create an intersubjectivity. Okay. We can call it interlinguality. I have called it interlinguality elsewhere. And replacing metaphysical claiming by paying attention to everyday conditions where common meaning is created, in mutual understanding and responsibility, beyond any ecstatic solipsism. If thus the mature Wittgenstein would like to speak of Christian theology, let's make him a Christian theologian for a while, his only concern would be the hidden presuppositions of doing theology. The practical, i.e. ascetic, everyday ways of creating common theological meaning. It needs an asceticism and a narcissistic asceticism to create common meaning. As a synergetic intersubjectivity in the making by means of an analogical, reciprocally achieved and verified inner meaningfulness, close paradoxically to what Palamas taught about the practical and applied way the personal energies, divine and human, converge into a reciprocal synergetic meaning or life in Christ, where both human self and divine being, along with human beings between them and creation, unite actively and unpassively without confusion. Of course, Palamas clearly goes in this way much further and beyond Wittgenstein, but he founds here because he founds an ontology. Just a few words, I'm in the very end of my paper, on Thomas Aquinas. It is important to say this, and I will ask for questions on that point, if you want. To ask me, in order to perhaps see what. For the reader of Questiones Disputata de Potentia, it is clear that, on the one hand, Thomas strives to avoid the dark, narcissistic aspect of an overflowing divinity, which produces the universe in a more or less unconscious way. But on the other hand, he seems to feel totally obliged to somehow combine the biblical creator with the Aristotelian prime mover. Thus, the divine operation does not have any real relationship with what it creates. This relationship only exists in the divine mind. This is another way for Thomas to express his Aristotelian conviction of sententia, that since an object can be an object of knowledge by a subject in a twofold way, either in connection with its subject's very being, or simply as it is in itself, God knows everything only in the former way. Since the action of his substance, to return to our first text, everything that is included in this substance is totally alien to created realities. Thus, it is impossible to claim that God receives any additional good through the fact that he produces beings. His action is pure generosity, continues Thomas, referring to Avicenna. Finally, and I quote, this is very important, it is impossible for him, for God, to be the subject of a real relation with the creature, even if a creature is the subject of a relation of which he is the end, in the way an effect is bound to its cause. This technical expression does not mean that God does not create communion with creatures, but that this communion, first, takes place in him, and second, that it takes place in his own terms, and without imparting his own being as it is to creatures. This is quite the opposite of what Palamas seems to mean, where he claims that the energy remains forever in the beings where it is said, as we saw above. If the divine energy remains as it is, and forever where it is sent, that means that here a permanent, reciprocal human-divine process of real and authentic either meaningfulness is possible. But in Thomas's case, and in the terms that we have created already, we rather have, instead of either meaningfulness, a monological meaningfulness, a dictated meaningfulness on the part of God, and in response, a human created meaningfulness, change in the subjective human event, even supernatural, but not clearly uncreated, precisely when it reaches man. This is implied by the fact that beatitude, while it is uncreated on the part of God, it is decisively created on the part of man. God gives to me is transformed into what I am. In Thomas's words, a quote, the created intellect does not see the divine essence according to the mode of its essence, but according to its, means the uncreated intellect's proper mode, which is finite. When these views were secularized some centuries later, God became the Lacanian false other of ideology, or the Feuerbachian fantasy of God in human mind, a view which derives precisely from the conviction that the infinite is simply a function of or projection of human intellect. This is Thomist in his core. I do not claim that we cannot find a theory of participation in Thomas, but it seems that this theory also suffers from a strong philosophical or metaphysical influence, even when it tries to get rid of it. Thomas's reading of Aristotle is, of course, decisively Christian. It is Christian. But he nonetheless seems at times to need a sort of patristic complement, since he tends to exhaustively overstress God's unity, something which is not wrong. It's not wrong, but becomes controversial when it happens at the expense of God's real and intentional, energetic involvement in creation. If it is true, on the other hand, that as I have claimed elsewhere, when these views were secularized, the modern self-referring subject appeared, then it is easy to think that Wittgenstein had precisely this sort of subject in his mind, along with this subject's imaginary way of constructing private language and metaphysical meaning, when he made his decisive anti-metaphysical turn toward what I called either subjectivity in the making, or what, following Palamas' understanding of dialogical synergy, we can even better call reciprocal meaning creating or intermeaningfulness. And we can stop here for the moment. Last phrase: it is important, as I think, to read tradition with a soul at the body, as Rimbaud once wrote. I like this book. But it is most important to read it while being surrendered to its living spiritual source. Then the Spirit will always give new life and further meaning to the letter. Thank you for your patience. Indeed. Wow.